Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are in the Johnson edition. We turned out a poem 668, Nature is What We See. Now notice right away in the Johnson edition that the word nature is capitalized and has quotation marks around it, and although nature itself is going to be repeated several times in this poem, it never again will be with this quotation mark around it, which is obviously Emily's way of kind of sending us a brief note that when she's speaking about nature, she's actually not talking about nature, but rather nature. In other words, to go back to our study of Plato and form theory from Republic 6 and 7, there is, of course, that first domain of those things which are what is physical. Images, of course, is referenced in Plato. And then there is something that is beyond the physical, kind of trans-linguistic, beyond, right? And of course, Emerson, a contemporary who we'll get to, had written a famous essay called Nature. We've given full lectures on it as well at learnstrong.net, where there's something profound about nature that has nothing to do with simply what we can see or what we can hear or et cetera, et cetera. Now, here, this is, of course, Emily as the great nature poet. And the great biographer Wisher, his comments on Emily in this regards are brilliant. So I'm going to quote him. More than any of her contemporaries, that includes Emerson, that includes Thoreau, that includes Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson preserved toward nature the attitude of the artist rather than of the philosopher. It was a model whose ever-changing subtleties of expression her pencil could approximate but never fully render. She was content to leave the great secret unguessed. Nature is a haunted house, but art a house that tries to be haunted, she wrote to Higginson. And in a poem beginning, Nature is What We See, of course the poem we're about to study, she stated the same conviction. She did not, so far as I know, ever conceive of the poet as capable of adding anything to nature, of improving upon nature's handiwork, though she was ready enough to alter a natural fact when it suited her purposes to do so. Nor did she blame or praise the natural order. She thought of it as an impersonal, inexorable, mysterious force to be reverenced, accepted, studied, enjoyed, and in all humility copied. But never for a moment was her own separateness to be merged with it. She called herself pagan in comparison with the devout souls among her acquaintance, but the truth is that her paganism, like Bryant's Thanatopsis, was an unconscious Puritanism. The Puritan conception of nature as a visible manifestation of God, which Jonathan Edwards and Bryant, in many of his earlier poems, overtly expressed, was so ingrained in her that she took it for granted without comment. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily's our playlist. I'm hopeful that you worked through our set of introductory comments as well as the preceding 667 poems. We just finished with 667, Bloom Upon the Mountain. Now, if you have done that study with us thus far, you will recognize this as another definition poem, and I want you to pay attention to the dialogic nature. It's a dialogue in this poem. One more reason we called our series Chats with Emily. One scholar has called this a meditation on nature's varied magnitudes, end quote. This is how she says it. Nature is what we see, the hill, the afternoon, squirrel, eclipse, the bumblebee. Nay, nature is heaven. Nature is what we hear, the bobolink, the sea, thunder, the cricket. Nay, nature is harmony. Nature is what we know, yet have no art to say. So impotent our wisdom is to her simplicity. Some of us have argued that this is maybe Emily's greatest poem. Some of my students have argued this is maybe one of Emily's greatest poems. It is so direct, and yet at the same time, much like our study of Dante, for example, it's very subtle, the argument that she's making. Notice with quotation marks around it, nature is what we see. I mean, really, how hard can it be? Nature is Ruthie's tree right out the window there, right? And in some ways, it's almost like nature is as a painting, right? Everything that's associated with summer flowers, inebriation, and even maybe a certain kind of sensuality, right? Nature is what we see. Notice that we go from simple to larger things, little to larger. The hill, and then all of a sudden the afternoon. And then all of a sudden we're back to something specific. Squirrels, and then we're to the eclipse, and then the bumblebee. Notice how she moves back and forth. The outer shell that contains the inner essence is how one scholar has pointed it out. And then she leaps, notice, from the small to the large, to the small back again. And then she uses the word nay. Now notice this happens, this dialogic kind of thing, 3 times. So some have said you could easily divide this poem up into 3 parts. Nay, nature is heaven. Of course, what is she arguing? No, nature isn't what we see, but rather what we cannot see. And then number 2, nature is what we hear, the sounds of nature, of course. And then she'll reference the bobolink, which is one of her favorite birds, mentioned in 12 poems. The sea, of course, something small to something huge. Thunder, something magnificent. The cricket, back to something specific like the bobolink. And then the second nay. Nay, nature is harmony. Notice capitalized. I can't help but point out that this is the only time in all of Emily's poetry she uses the word harmony. Remarkable, right? And to make the other observation, it's very possible that her reading of Wordsworth's lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey, you'll remember that he says this, we see into the life of things, that harmony that he keeps speaking about. We've given full lectures on that poem at learnstrong.net. Finally, number 3, well, nature isn't what we see and nature isn't what we hear. Then what is nature? Well, nature is what we know. Now we're back to our epistemology of our big 5. Go back to our introductory lectures where we're always asking about epistemology, what you can know, ontology, who we are, psychology, the study of the individual mind, sociology, the study of the collective mind, and then finally the question of theodicy. We're to that first of the big 5, epistemology. Nature is what we know. And then she'll say, yet have no art to say. In other words, we're back to chats with Emily, aren't we? Emily's like, I want to say what nature is, but I don't have the words. It's translinguistic. It's beyond words. A beautiful sunset, as we've been reading a number of poems, or sunrises, of course, other poems. You can't put that to words, right? It's beyond language. Nature's what we know, yet have no art to say, and so she'll say it. So impotent, our wisdom. Notice our here capitalized, so we go we, our, right? Wisdom, notice capitalized. The first of the 4 cardinal virtues of Plato, wisdom, of course, courage, then discipline or temperance, and then finally justice. With, of course, the Pauline virtues to finish the important 7, faith, hope, and love. Notice, so impotent our wisdom is to her simplicity, right? Notice, by the way, she'll use simplicity in 5 more of her poems. This is the first time she's used it. When we get to poem 1463, we're going to see what Wisher calls her very best nature poem. At 2a, I think it is that nature is translinguistic. At 2b, the dialogic structure of this poem. At 3a, Emerson's nature, of course, comes to mind, as does, of course, Thoreau's Walden. Finally, how does Emily draw out of you your view of nature? I hope she's challenging you. Thank you.